right, so let me begin a little bit about myself. Long ago, I started teaching in schools in Singapore from the Ministry of Education. So I had the blessing of starting. I've been to primary and secondary and colleges here in Singapore many years ago. And then I went to research, educational research. In Singapore, there is just one teacher training institute in Singapore. So I did about 5 years there, educational research work. And then I went to do my doctorate in education in UCL London. And ever since then, I guess I've been doing ed research for quite some time. And something that I thought that is close to my heart is actually talk. Discourse, talk, and thinking, because many of the students here in Singapore, even though English is first language, they feel that they are more proficient in their mother tongue because of that bilingual education, and many have got this misconception that critical thinking is only for those who are of a higher ability, or critical thinking is only achievable for students who are more competent in the English language and who has maybe mastered the language. So I'm on a personal mission, I think, to get many of our students, undergraduates and graduates here in Singapore, even worldwide, if I can, and that critical thinking is not an exclusive skill, that anyone can achieve criticality in thought. And that's a personal mission of mine. So we are here. I am so blessed to see everyone joining us this morning, over 100 of you. And it's amazing because seemingly just overnight, the world has changed and we are expected to be very proficient and well-versed in working remotely, speaking to others in other parts of the world, using video communications. And business leaders and employers are saying that they still expect this level of proficiency from our students, but yet they notice this quality gap, and that our students are not quite as polished, they're not quite able to maybe speak effectively, efficiently, demonstrating criticality. And that's a concern for us here at the Singapore Institute of Technology, because as an applied learning university, we are very, very dedicated and committed to make sure that our students are future ready. Pandemic or not, we want our students to be able to represent themselves, innovate for the future of their discipline, and can't quite run away from criticality of thought. And that's my argument, actually. Here I say that once upon a time in Singapore, very interestingly, the endeavor to be successful in life is actually when you've achieved a couple of C's in life, like say cash, condo, credit card. It's quite funny that that's the aspiration of the young ones at that time. But of course, I would argue that now, as an academic, and we see our students all the time, we know that the 6 C's that get our students hired is actually communication. And that's always number one for me. If I meet students who are graduating as nurses or as robotics engineers, still I emphasize content is one. I listed that at number 4, but first you have to be able to communicate your discipline or within your discipline. Construction, I thought, is also very key, because however we communicate, however we teach our students to communicate, the way that communication is constructed is actually very, very important. What format it's going to be in, what's the modality that's going to be used. Carrying ourselves, I tell the students, it's how you carry yourself, and content at your fingertips. How comfortable you are communicating, because I also tell them that is the opposite of comfort, is actually awkward. So are you going to be an awkward speaker, or are you going to be an awkward communicator? How do you be comfortable with your communication? And finally, compelling is whatever it is that you you say or communicate with others, are others going to say yes? Are they going to give you buy-in? Is it compelling enough? And of course, at the end of the day, I tell my students that criticality is something that they cannot discount. Previously, I was in US not too long ago. Just last year, I moved from the National University of Singapore to Singapore Institute of Technology, because I wanted to see how the various research areas that I am interested in can be pursued here at SIT, because of the applied learning nature. And yeah, later within this presentation, I will show you some of the findings from some of the larger scale research that we've done. So back to blended learning, and I am heartened to hear that colleagues worldwide are constantly continuing this discussion about blended learning. In a pretty large scale research that we did in NUS, the National University of Singapore, it's about blending learning, how flipped or blended learning model, and how that's received by the engineering students there. So part of the research is also asking the students for their perceived experience, and based on all of their experiences about blended learning, what is it that they like and do not like about it? And this is just a very simple word cloud to show the students are saying that they do not like blended learning because they prefer one-on-one, or they prefer face-to-face because they prefer the class time being physical. They think or have this misconception, or maybe it is real based on their lived experiences, that they haven't got much time to clarify their doubts, and that they have this understanding that there has to be a lot of preparation involved when it comes to blended learning, and thus opting for face-to-face is because they think that the studying, the crux of the studying only happen when they meet their profs face-to-face. And then at the same time, there's also quite a number of students, it's pretty split. Students are also saying that, hey, they do like blended learning because they believe that they've got the flexibility, they are able to understand the content and beforehand, and that they think that the pace is excellent. Whatever materials that's been pushed to them, they're able to watch them at their own time. Convenience, some of the keywords there. And thus opting for blended learning is because they believe in the flexibility and the learning of with blended learning models. Whatever it is that the students said about blended learning, what they like about it or not, I felt that at the core of it, and also it's supported by literature, it is the design of the blended learning environment. So many colleagues here in Singapore at once upon a time, maybe when we're moving towards online teaching, they're doing the same thing, but in a different platform. So is that the way? If we have to do emergency remote teaching, ERT, we talked about that a couple of years ago when the pandemic started, we simply pivoted whatever that we have that we're going to deliver in our classes face-to-face, we simply move it online. Perhaps that may not be the best way. Of course, we're talking about the affordances of the technology. What is it that we're doing online that is different from what we do face-to-face? But what do we have online, the affordances of technology that we may or may not be able to use it or need not use when we are face-to-face? Many, many considerations. Yeah, so in this, well, not quite a workshop, but a webinar, I thought that we could hear from you too. What are your thoughts about, critical thinking, and especially within the context of blended learning? If we are not, if we do not have the physical presence that we typically have with our students in class, how would our design of our instruction, if it's a blended learning environment, be like when we want to develop our students' critical thinking? What are the various critical thinking models and frameworks out there, and why are we picking one, or why are we creating these principles in our own frameworks? And the problems of critical thinking, right? And then this push, my colleagues and I are are working on this push. We have this initiative in Singapore Institute of Technology where we say that we are empowering the SIT students, the citizens, to be critical thinkers, and we do so with a push to make critical thinking visible and explicit. I'll also share with you the adopted framework that we take here in SIT, the Paul Elder framework. Some of you may have heard, or many of you may have heard of this framework. And then, of course, criticality, we can't quite run away from the fact that we do have to model it for our students, and we do so with dialogic scaffolding. And towards the end, we'll talk about the blended learning environment and some of the affordances of the tech-enhanced learning environment with online discussion forums. All right, so I do have this. I thought that if I could get your thoughts on critical thinking, there are a couple of statements here on a simple Likert scale between strongly disagree and strongly agree. I would like you, if you can, scan the QR code, or if not, go to Mentimeter and use that code, 61122 whichever that's convenient for you. Share with us. I will open the live results of this Mentimeter, and let's see where we are at. Okay, respond to the statements. I'll give you about 2 to 3 minutes. I know what critical thinking is or what it entails. I know how critical thinking is applied in any discipline. I know about critical thinking well enough to teach it effectively. And I am confident in my ability to teach and assess critical thinking in any course or subject. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Prof. Clemente. Thank you. All right. So let's see whether we've got any responses yet. Yes, excellent, excellent. All right. So it's really quite consistent with how we are surveying colleagues here in Singapore in terms of our understanding of what critical thinking is. We may adopt some frameworks and models. We know how to do critical thinking. We ourselves are striving to ensure there's criticality in thought in whatever that we do in our research work and in our work. But the challenge is applying it to any discipline is a constant challenge, because of course there are evidence-based research out there who talks about critical thinking as a subject on its own and how we apply critical thinking into disciplines. Once upon a time, NACE 1989 talked about this, whether or not it's going to be a generalist or it's going to be a content-specific approach to getting our students to develop critical thinking. I've got a slide on that later and I'll show it to you. What NIST 1989 talked about in the past and what scholars are saying about it now. Applying it to any discipline is always something of a consideration for us, especially for myself when I'm doing business comms design and I meet students from any faculty. Teaching it effectively and yes, and the confidence of assessing critical thinking. And I do have a slide on assessment as well and how that is very problematic. I remember many years ago when I first started to look into critical thinking and the teaching of it and assessing of it and faculty development on developing critical thinking courses, I got students to respond in what is critical thinking to you, right? And a student actually responded with this: critical thinking is thinking harder, like that. And I was quite excited, and at the same time I'm surprised that it is still that way, because when I was in school, when I was a student, teachers or profs would tell me, Nadya, you have to demonstrate a lot more critical thinking in your work, right? But it's so this concept of critical thinking is almost so abstract. What it is, what is it, and how do we do it? How do we do critical thinking? And apparently our students do not know how. They cannot quite put their finger onto it, right? So that's the impetus for my work in critical thinking. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Quite a number of you responded there. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide, and the next slide here is, just a minute. All right. So the next slide here is another QR code, if you indulge me. For this one will be a little bit more open-ended. What does critical thinking look like to you? If it is to be made visible in your lectures, in your seminars, and your tutorials, what would it look like, critical thinking? If you could once again key in your responses, and I will show live what your responses look like. Okay. All right, so the easiest would be to scan that QR code. If not, let's see responses now. Iceberg, excellent. Not to rest on one's laurels, not to go beyond the superficial. Excellent, yes. Reflection and metacognition. Deep thinking, think deeper. Yeah, exactly. And many of these, while it may be clear to us as faculty and academia, apparently students may not see it the way we do it, and that's granted because it is from their perspective, and it is also from our perspective that can be different. Seeing beyond the obvious, yes. Active questioning, not passive acceptance, regurgitation, what's being presented. Excellent, yes. I like that active questioning is what we can actually see, and our students see too. If we demonstrate that active questioning, they're able to pinpoint, and is this criticality? They are able to experience it, they're able to see it. Although part of our research also talks about how visible is that in our classrooms, knowing the context, scanning their environment. Yes. Alternative views, yes. More of applying abstract concepts in real life situations and thinking beyond what is given, yes. Excellent. Many of these are somewhat like perhaps demonstrated in activities, in students' work. Rich discussion, voices of learners are heard. Excellent, yes. Deep engagement with the text or subject, yes, involving analysis. Yes, so we know that critical thinking is a cognitive process, and more often than not, it is insight here. It's inside our heads, it's inside our students' head, but the trick is really to get it out of them, to make them see their own thoughts, to make them engage with their own and each other's thoughts, such that it is very explicit application of critical thinking tools, very visible for us and for our students. Conceptual questions, openness to difficulty and discomfort. I love that. Exactly. Yes, because many scholars in critical thinking also talk about dispositions. We talk about skills. Yes, we talk about how we're making thinking beyond the superficial, going to the deeper part of the iceberg. But sometimes we forget that doing all these can actually develop certain critical thinking traits or dispositions. In the 1990s, many scholars touched on dispositions as well. Bird's eye view. These are excellent, colleagues, yes. And I also thought that it is interesting that many of these activities or skills are actually demonstrated within or applied within the discourse of the classroom. If you can just call it classroom discourse, effective questioning, evaluation, metacognition, all this would be demonstrated, and I argue modeled by the tutor or instructor with talk. And that's why I'm also fascinated with talk. So classroom discourse is really important. Right, so that's the title of the webinar, right? Critical thinking. How do we get our students to develop critical thinking? And if it's and talk would be one very powerful pedagogic tool. And thus, dialogic teaching and learning, or scaffolding, or dialogic scaffolding would be a very powerful consideration when it comes to our pedagogic tool to develop critical thinking in our students. Yes, thank you so much, colleagues. Okay. All right, just one more if you'll indulge me. Okay, so just now we were talking about what does it look like to you? Have you reflected on how exactly do you develop these critical thinking skills or in our students? How? What exactly do you do? Do you engage them with talk? How exactly? Yeah, I think a couple of you did talk about how exactly, but if you haven't reflected on it, could you then reflect on how? How do you develop critical thinking in your students? What do you do, or what do you make your students do? All right, it's either that code or that QR code that you can scan, and I'll switch to the live results in a minute. All right. I love that. Bribing them. Fair. That's fair enough. Yes. Yes. Critical essays. Read different texts. I like that. Core group of students to lead first half of the discussion. Very interesting. brainstorming, asking them questions. Yes, we always do, isn't it? We always ask our students questions. Reminds me of another, once upon a time, Sinclair and Coulthard. Was it 1979, Sinclair and Coulthard? Classroom discourse, a very typical discourse structure in our classrooms is IRE or IRF, right? We will always see a tutor or instructor initiating a question, waiting for a response, and that is from the student, and then right away evaluating that response. Sinclair, Coulthard, IRE. And since then, more recently would be Mercer from the UK, if I'm not wrong, Cambridge professor. Mercer talked about extending that IRE into IR, and delaying the evaluation or the feedback from the tutor, and in fact handing over the evaluation part of the discourse structure to the students. And thus they argued extended talk or exploratory talk. Yeah, so that we will move away from the standard IRE that once upon a time Sinclair and Coulthard talk about. Asking, right, teaching our students to ask good questions. Excellent. Yes, and applying it relating to their respective fields. Yes, excellent. Pose questions that require them to look at different perspectives. Position paper. Yes, analyze issues of position paper. The discussion we had about that is that when students engage with the paper, there's actually scholars in this part of the world, Singapore, I think there's a ton 2018 who talked about how critical thinking is jarring for our students in this part of the world, maybe in Singapore, because it is against their somewhat jarring to their culture of critiquing. And that the argument is that culturally critical thinking is challenging for Asian students. Again, I think it is East Asians here, this part of the world, because our students are not brought up to engage in any critical thinking. And then again, I would argue that is stemming from the misconception that critical thinking is being censorious, isn't it? Just about being critical and being negative. That's the misconception, and that I thought is very interesting. Critical thinking and culture, and some scholars. Providing materials that prompt questions, yes, and then propelling that into interactions. Creating a safe space, excellent. Yes, and that is a link to what scholars are saying about how Asian students think that critical thinking is not for them because they think it is the right to question others, the right to evaluate others is against their cultural beliefs. It's just so very interesting. Examining real world cases, yes. Modeling to the students how to process problem. I love that. And we model by annotating our text. We model by annotating our talk. And that's also another part of the research work. I can't wait to engage in a discussion with everyone here. This is really, really excellent. Yeah, and like I said, all of these, can you imagine the challenge of seeing what we see, we envision critical thinking is like in our classroom with the slide that you had earlier, with the responses you had earlier, what you envision critical thinking to look like, and how we endeavor to develop critical thinking in our students with all of these. Can you imagine them without dialogue, without talk? And that's why I think at the end of the day, we will always see or experience talk in a typical classroom, right? For typically developed students, we'll always see talk. And thus, considering discourse or talk or dialogic teaching and learning and dialogic scaffolding as a pedagogic tool is really, really crucial. What have we not considered about our talk in our classrooms, and how is that linked to developing critical thinking? Excellent. Thank you. Right. So where are we at? We all know why we're here. We've been talking about critical thinking for so many years. In fact, the latest future of work and the list of skills that's going to propel us into the future, critical thinking is there within the top 5, actually. And that scholars are talking about how faculty from various Institute of Higher Learning are trying to include criticality in all programs, all courses, and all disciplines. But that's the one I was talking about as well. Other than Tan, who's in Singapore, Turner 2006 talk about why is it that students in Asia are generally weak. And again, I think there are some limitations of that study there, and how critical thinking is actually culturally biased against Asian students. And that was, I thought, a fascinating study. Yes, we talk about critical thinking in higher education and how that's going to be a learning outcome that's valued, a valued competency for work, and that many professional accreditation bodies or standards are calling for critical thinking or demonstration of criticality in our graduates, right? Now, this one, I think it's worth sharing as well. I find it really fascinating that from 1990, Farsioni talked about critical thinking, and at that time it was quite revolutionary for faculty, because critical thinking was then linked to learning outcomes and to reporting verbs. And from then on, what naturally pursued was that educators looked into critical thinking in rubrics, and thus there's been many rubrics where critical thinking is supposedly embedded or integrated in our rubrics. But the question is, if we are assessing critical thinking and including it in our rubrics, how is it matching, or how is it aligned with our instructions and with our pedagogical approaches? And thus scholars are also talking about the misalignments, right? And then we will have, then 1994, King and Kishner talk about various stages of critical thinking. And these stages are like, perhaps the characteristics are more reflective in nature. And thus educators use King and Kishner a lot in reflective essays. And then there's also, not too long after 1996, Kronholm talked about critical thinking when it comes to activities, what sort of activities, and educators try to develop students' critical thinking in accordance to the various phases of activities. Right, from just a general introduction and pros and cons of issues towards the phase on 7th, the final phase, which is on retrospective reflection. Yes, and then of course there are various studies comparing dispositions. We talk about the skills of doing uncovering assumptions, looking at different perspectives, but many scholars also talk about the very traits of a critical thinker, right? Being fair-minded, being open-minded, being inquisitive, yeah, and some of the other traits. So yeah, this is what I was sharing just now about the different models. And Bayer as well, not to forget, 1995, in between King and Kitchener and Kronholm, talk about the various cognitive operations. Yes. Right. And Bayer himself also talked about disposition. So there are many critical thinking models and frameworks out there, but at SIT, when we have this university-wide endeavor to get our students to be critical thinkers in a very explicit and visible manner, we adopted one framework, and I think I might have jumped the gun there a little bit, but the main thing for this endeavor was the motivation to tackle some of these problems. While there have been many varied definitions and various foci of the critical thinking, there's still this disconnect. 2008, there's a big study in the US. The disconnect here, it's about how our students perceive very differently about their critical thinking experiences, and that the disconnect there is the gap between what faculty believe we have afforded our students with what our students report their perceived experience of critical thinking. So in other words, faculty is saying that we have criticality in our curriculum. We are developing critical thinking in our students. It's there, it's here, we do this, we do that. But our students are reported where? Did we? So that disconnect is really, really very fascinating, and I am trying to look into it here as well in Singapore, and we want to address why is there that there is this disconnect. Yes, and of course, assessing is always a problem with assessing critical thinking. All right, so what is critical thinking? We assume everyone knows what it is and we all understand what it is. And that critical thinking is supposed to be a pan-human faculty. That means it's regardless of culture, it is with a common understanding, but then our definitions have not been done in a way that scholars would use pan-human concepts. It's very, very interesting. So, and in the end, some scholars are also arguing that critical thinking has got such complex definitions that that could be Anglo-centric, that we understand it from English perspective. Wisbitker, yes, 2013. She was the one who argued that we do have an Anglo-centric view or definition of critical thinking. Let's look at the various definitions of critical thinking. Dewey in 1930s, 40s, Glasser, right, in 1987. You notice how increasingly complex the definitions of critical thinking are. And then towards the 90s, I've shown you Farsioni and King-Kitchener earlier, Kronholm, right? And towards the 2000s, right? There's been an endeavor to simplify it, to somehow come to a, I don't think scholars have been coming to a consensus, but trying to offer a new perspective to what critical thinking is and defining it as accurately as possible. But it will always be challenging, right? Just excuse me. Yes, this was the one that I was talking about. Ennis 1989 talked about how we implement critical thinking in our curriculum. Apologies, I do have this nagging cough. All right, so Ennis in 1989 talked about whether or not we have critical thinking as an isolated course, right? There is this direct and explicit instruction teaching critical thinking with maybe problems or issues we encounter day-to-day life. And then there's also the infusion method where we would have content-specific instruction. Then there's the immersion approach and a combination of general and content-specific approaches. I'm going to just pop a cough drop. Yes, and the many scholars, we talk about the various different types of implementation of critical thinking in our courses. If you have a look at this slide, let's ask ourselves, which ones of this type of implementation have we considered in our instruction? Has it been an immersion approach, number 3, but critical thinking is not explicitly taught? Or would it be a combination? Yes, we do integrate or embed critical thinking within our courses, and at the same time, we are very explicit about the teaching of those skills. All right, where am I? Yes, so some questions for us to think about. So do we see critical thinking applied in our course or in our program? Why or why not? And if we do we adopt a model? Right. I would argue that a curated set of principles about criticality is very important in our in such a way that it is an adopted pedagogical conceptual framework that would guide the instructions, that would guide the instructional activities, and as well as the assessment in the course. Right. So if we do these, then what would it look like and when it's applied in our courses, especially when it is a discipline-specific course? If I were to recommend a design of a course with maybe an embedded critical design thinking in an engineering course, how will that be very different from a course that is from the health sciences? So we thought that in the push to make critical thinking visible, at least these three things can be considered by the faculty. So at SIT, again, there's this push for this community of practice for all faculty to think about a pedagogical framework, or if it's linked to your teaching philosophy, what would that set of principles of critical thinking look like, and how can it be curated into a framework that you adopt for the teaching and learning of your course? And how will that then inform the instructional activities that you design? Specific tools and components of critical thinking that's embedded into your lessons, your discussions, and your tasks. And then it's assessment. How would the very critical thinking tools and principles and components be then integrated into assessment? So pedagogical framework, curated tools, no matter where you pick them from, whichever critical thinking scholar, that is aligned very explicit and visibly throughout the activities and assessment. And that's the key considerations that we get faculty here at SIT to consider: the consistent approach to integrate critical thinking explicitly and visibly in their course. Also because this, you see, once upon a time, we talked about explicit instruction. We all know as educators that sometimes skills need to be taught in an explicit manner so that the students are able to grasp these skills. But it's argued that because it is from the tutor's perspective, that on its own is not internalized by students. So from the student's perspective, it needs to be visible for them. And talking about visible, Hattie, an Australian professor, talk about visible learning. And thus we realize that here in SIT, only if there is this very good play between the tutor's perspective and student's perspective, when it's explicit and visible, only then this iterative cycle will get our students to internalize critical thinking. And this would a lot more research needs to look into this, you know, this argument that it has to be explicit and visible because of the various perspectives of student and tutor, because it will address that that research that shows the disconnect, right? Faculty believe we have afforded our students with critical thinking development, but our students are saying, no, they can't quite see where, how. All right. So at SIT, we decided very simply, perhaps if we could pick one model that everyone can agree upon to just be the basis to as a starting point. Many of our STEM's professors have got their perspective and their definition of what criticality looks like in their engineering classrooms and lectures. But the problem is always that disconnect. So at SIT, we're trying to say, okay, we all know what critical thinking looks like to us, and we all know what we're going to do about it in our classes, but our students are not capturing it. So how can we bridge that? So that's why the push within the community of practice to perhaps start with a starting point, making it a consistent, explicit, and visible with first a pedagogical framework to rely on. so that instructions, instructional activities, and assessment can then always be referred back to that particular framework that you've picked as a program, as a faculty, as a faculty or department. So what we've done is that, again, with that explicit and visible in mind, to get our students to internalize critical thinking, we actually developed or produced a video just to get our students to have that shared understanding of what critical thinking is. So this is in collaboration with a department for the teaching and learning unit in SIT. We came up with this video. And this video is part of a micro module for all of SIT students to go through on their own. And that builds that same foundation of critical thinking. This is video number 2 when we introduced the Paul and Elder framework. Allow me to play for everyone. It's just a couple of minutes. Once again, the audience will be students. Previously, in part 1 of our video series on empowering citizens to be critical thinkers, you learned what critical thinking is and why it is important. In this video, you'll be introduced to the Paul Elder critical thinking framework. It consists of 3 components that work together. First, you would need to think of 8 elements of thought when you're engaged in any form of reasoning. Next, you would need to apply the 10 intellectual standards to evaluate the elements of thought. Finally, as critical thinkers, you would strive to develop dispositions like the 8 intellectual traits. Now, let's begin by looking at the 8 elements of thought. In any effort to think critically about something, these 8 elements are present. To evaluate if thinking is critical, you need to first identify these 8 elements in your thinking. Each of these elements has implications for the others. If you change your purpose or agenda, you change your questions and problems. If you change your questions and problems, you are forced to seek new information and data, and so on. One easy way for you to remember the 8 elements of thought and to link them is to remember these 2 sentences. When we think for a purpose within a point of view based on assumptions leading to implications and consequences. We use data, facts, and experiences to make inferences and interpretations based on concepts and theories to address a question, issue, or problem. You may also find these clarifying questions helpful for you to understand more about the element of thought that you're thinking about. Now that you've learned more about the 8 elements of thought, why not think about the program or any particular module that you're reading? Then try to apply each of the elements of thought onto the discipline or any aspect of the module. For example, if you study bioengineering, you may think of the purpose of the program, which is to apply engineering to medicine and biology. Also, a positive implication of studying this discipline is that you'll get to design solutions to improve our quality of life. In the next 2 videos, you will learn more about the remaining 2 components of the framework: intellectual standards and intellectual traits. All right, so with that adopted framework, we then get our students to practice these very specific critical thinking tools, the elements of thought, and then afterwards to assess and evaluate their thinking, the intellectual standards. So it's a series of 4 very short videos, and then we get our students to keep applying them in whatever course. So that was suggested in the video just now, where at the very first we get our students to unpack the elements of thought based on their discipline. So I did conduct a couple of faculty development workshops, and this would be one of the activities that we get our faculty to think about. Okay, so we were saying just now, so we have the critical thinking tools or critical thinking principles curated into a framework. The next would be then developing these in our classroom using talk. I keep referring to it as a pedagogic tool, because how do we engage our students in our classes? How do we get them to ask or learn the art of asking good questions? Long ago, we've already talked about how an effective teacher would not attempt to dominate talk in the classroom. And even as recent as 2010, Mahil talked about the image of the teacher as the orchestrator, right? The one who conducts responses, like as if the tutor holds the very power and the very position in terms of authority to then dictate who gets to speak and who gets to extend our understanding about any particular topic. Right, I'll skip this. I'm mindful of time, but I do want to show you a couple of things. So what is this push towards dialogic pedagogy, right? For our students and tutor to jointly interrogate, to jointly critically interrogate whatever it is that we're talking about and discussing in the classroom, such that there are multiple voices and points of view heard, informed by practice, and considering various development of ideas with student, teacher, or tutor identities considered. So Alexander talked about dialogic teaching once upon a time, to 2017, as recent as 2017, that there are these 5 considerations. Whatever talk, that whatever concepts, whatever instruction we have designed for our course or program, that it is purposeful, that it is collective, that it's reciprocal, supportive, and cumulative. So the dialogic teaching and learning needs to consider these factors in our classroom. So one activity I get faculty to think about would be then we have to contextualize dialogic teaching, say in a hypothetical lesson on a particular topic. So if we imagine we ask a student a question, right, a critical question, following a response, what other follow-up questions can we pose to help our students develop the supposed higher levels of criticality? Because once the typical IRE, we tend to always go back, Sinclair Couhart's IRE. We ask a question, we wait for a response, and then we evaluate. Who are we to be evaluating our students' responses? Why not pass on that responsibility to evaluate to other students? And that, I would argue, we do not do enough, right? So we won't be able to do these activities online. But one recommendation, Paul and Elder talked about this, is to prepare a Socratic dialogic discussion. Many faculty know that, okay, I'm going to apply, or I'm going to design a whole class discussion or small group discussion, but other than come up with the very topics to focus on, it's very rarely that we come up with a list of critical questions or Socratic questioning that we prepare in advance that can then be posed to our students, and we model it for our students. One part of the large-scale study that we did using the Paul and Elder as the very basic or the starting point of a curated set of critical thinking tools that we get our students to learn is that we get faculty to annotate their talk. So whenever we engage our students in this dialogic teaching and learning in the classroom, making sure that it is purposeful, cumulative, reciprocal, supportive, we annotate the talk in the classroom. So if, let's say, a question is asked, I then annotate my question and say, you notice that I am actually unpacking the issue with the standard breadth. And if a student responds, I would then annotate the student's response and say, I see that you've applied the standard significance. And what would you say about that? How would you respond? And pass on that responsibility of responding to another student instead. So these are excellent tools for our consideration. Again, with the context of developing critical thinking, we use talk as a pedagogic tool. And like many of you have shared, the art of asking good questions, considering points of view, if that is not modeled in an explicit and visible manner, our students seemingly experience that learning experience in the classroom, and for some reason are not able to internalize those very skills out and use them or demonstrate them outside of our classes. Right? So again, the asking of questions, if that can be asked in a manner that would use the very same critical thinking tools that we have picked and gotten our students to learn, then with this iterative explicitness and visible nature of the use of these tools will then our students internalize critical thinking. All right, so the dialogic scaffolding is there. So this is also something very close to my heart, because when it comes to talk as a pedagogic tool, many faculty tell me that exactly the title of this webinar, right? If I do not talk, my students don't. So I keep asking them why. What have they assumed to actually say that? What is it that they're thinking, their students are thinking about? What goes on in their students' head? What about our faculty's talk that is somehow not allowing our students to talk too in class? And I love how I think I saw the psychological safety net there to make it a safe space. And this is also another topic that's close to my heart on how care as a teaching tool, how can we develop, or how can we use how can we demonstrate care in our teaching and learning, so that empathetic communication as a tutor is also a part of how we do dialogic teaching and learning. And that in Alexander's 5 consideration, care is actually there, isn't it? It's supportive. If we do not demonstrate that care in our talk, then how will our students feel that they are engaged in a very supportive environment in the classroom? Yeah. So for scaffolding, when we use talk to scaffold our students' learning, many educators also have this misconception that just about any help is scaffolding. Is that true? Right? Oh, I do scaffold my students' learning in my classroom. I give them this, I give them that, I give them a prompt. That is scaffolding. Then if that is not scaffolding, and what is? I would say yes, that is scaffolding. Any kind of help or guidance is scaffolding, but scaffolding is much bigger than that. Especially when we use talk to scaffold, dialogic scaffolding is even bigger than that. And scholars like here, 2010, this reference, at the very least, scaffolding has to have 3 stages. First, we will have to have contingency. We will need to know where our students are at. And then we employ certain scaffolding techniques, right? With a consideration of what is the mean to which we are scaffolding? Are we using questioning as a mean to scaffold? Are we instructing as a mean to scaffold? And then also considering the intention of our scaffolding before we fade, because scaffolding naturally is temporary. Right, so we need to fade our support until the entire responsibility is then transferred to the student. So many a times when I speak to faculty, just about any scaffolding, just about any help or support is considered scaffolding without considering the contingency. Where is that scaffolding technique employed and for what purpose? So dialogic scaffolding, I have a lot actually to say and lots for us to consider. We also develop a checklist of some sort, right? A checklist for faculty to think about how is dialogic teaching and learning used? What kind of questions are being posed in our classroom, such that we are using dialogic teaching and learning purposefully. Already it's a consideration in Alexander's dialogic teaching and learning. How are we providing this means of assisting performance? Are we modeling for our students? Are we instructing them? Are we using questioning? So if we, in the large scale study that we had in NUS, the findings showed that of all the classroom discourse transcribed and analyzed, the only mean that we see in terms of majority is questioning and instructing. Rarely do we see faculty modeling the very skill that they want the students to acquire. Yes, or feeding back, or structuring the cognition of our students' responses. But most of the time, we are asking questions. In fact, we're asking a lot of questions. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves, how can we structure the cognition in our classroom such that the ones asking questions are not us? Our students are the one asking questions. Right, so those are the means of scaffolding, and this would be the functions of the dialogic scaffolding. So why are we doing what we're doing? For what purpose? Is the function to direct the maintenance of the way students jointly construct knowledge? Is our function, say, marking critical features, like what I said just now, annotating our talk and our students' talk? There you are responding with the standard of significance. Oh, thank you for that, so and so. I see that you've highlighted the breadth and depth of the matter. Marking it, annotating it, I would say, right? So these are the various means and functions of dialogic scaffolding. Yes. I do have a couple of slides to show how the study and how the analysis of the work was done. I'm not going to go through them. I do want to leave some time for us to have a chat, but this would be how some of the analysis looks like. The various communicative act that we studied from a face-to-face discourse, right? What is the scaffolding technique? You know, what principle of dialogic teaching is there? What is the means to which we are scaffolding or doing a dialogic teaching? All that in the hopes of developing criticality in our students. So there's always a lot of questioning in our talk and a lot of instructing in our talk. But ever since the push to make critical thinking explicit and visible, we are seeing faculty marking or annotating their talk such that it is explicit and visible for our students. There is one slide, if I could highlight just that bit. Here. So how are you questioning relevance here in determining effectiveness? So this is excellent, because making it the push to make it explicit and visible, marking critical features of talk, relevance is a standard in that Paul and Elder framework. So we are noticing that with this study, faculty members are actually doing more than just asking questions and expecting answers. And this is actually in an engineering leadership classroom. And then, now that we're talking about blended learning, we cannot run away from the use of online discussion forum. So in online discussion forum, it is also very doable to mark and annotate our students' responses. You see, long gone were the time when we say, all right, your task is, before our webinar next week, I need you to put up a post on a particular topic and respond to another person's post, right? So when we do that, our students are just, you know, responding to the post in a very superficial manner, and maybe some will be able to engage with that topic with a lot more depth, but engaging one another in an online discussion forum, especially when we're doing emergency remote teaching or blended models, they aren't able to go further than just being in agreement or disagreement. So when I get my students to engage with one another in online discussion forums, I ban the words agree and disagree, right? Because I want the students to know that it's beyond that very binary. It's either you are here or there, right? I want them to respond to the issue, engage with one another, considering the various critical thinking tools, right? So you notice here, students are using the element of thought interpretation. Students are applying the intellectual standards of breadth. In fact, I also get students to annotate their responses in the forum. If they want to respond something, I teach them to annotate that response. Which standard are you using to say this? Which element of thought are you using to unpack this? So the more they do that, the more they internalize those critical thinking tools. So, and I tell the students the ultimate goal is for them to not need to annotate anymore, such that that internalization of critical thinking tools has happened, and then they would not, it becomes second nature for them. Critical thinking becomes a second nature, right? And this study produced, or rather a kind of suggests that there has to be a framework when we get our students to do forum discussion. That it's not just a matter of posting something and responding to others, right? That as tutors or instructor, we have to consider how students engage one another online in a way that make those critical thinking tools very explicit, such that they achieve those different phases. Are they just discovering and exploring ideas and highlighting any dissonance or inconsistency? Or are they able to at least face agreement or application for new contexts? Or are they testing and modifying the knowledge bit in other contexts? Yeah, so this one is the interaction analysis model, and that is used together with the Paul and Elder critical thinking framework. So how can they achieve these interaction analysis model with the critical thinking tools? And that study showed that indeed, when it is made explicit and visible in like this, where students are annotating what critical thinking tools, and when they know that there are various stages or phases to achieve when it comes to jointly constructing their knowledge and understanding, only then are we seeing such quality and demonstration of high levels of criticality of thought versus the I agree with your point, indeed is something, and that's it. Right, so going beyond the superficial. I am super mindful of time. I think I do have just a few more slides to go when it comes to what does it mean for us in terms of practice. So again, in light of getting our students to internalize critical thinking tools, getting them to achieve high levels of criticality of thought, how are we using talk as pedagogic tool? How are we achieving dialogic teaching and learning and to develop criticality in our students? Already we see that the iterative cycles of making sure that there's supportive, collective, reciprocal considerations in our talk. Only then can that facilitate deeper meaning-making experiences for our students, right? I think that's, and at the end of the day, could we actually come up with a new model of blended learning? From our work, this is 2015, a community of inquiry study, the use of COI. We do know that blended learning is a blend of online and face-to-face, right? But what is key to make that connection? The meaningful connection between the online learning experiences, whether synchronous or asynchronous, to what we have face-to-face is actually key. So here at SIT, we are in early stages of trying to find out what is that connection? How will that connection look like? In what form? What task or activity or what platform or what modality do we use to connect what's done outside of class and what's done in class? And COI is just a starting point, right? That framework of community of inquiry. Could we, and other scholars are also talking about something else. It's not just about teaching presence, cognitive presence, social presence. What other presences do we consider? Yeah, so ultimately, could we come up with our own framework or model of blended learning? Yeah. I think I will stop here, colleagues. I've never spoken so much without responses for everyone. So I am absolutely grateful for everyone for indulging me with this time. May I pass on the time to organizers if there is to be anyone interested to share your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadia, for your in-depth and organized, structured talk on critical thinking. Again, let's give a round heart of reacts to Dr. Nadia.
Thank you.
Ayan. Okay, so at this point, we're inviting faculty members or participants and members in this Zoom meeting to a Q&A. You may directly ask Dr. Nadia your questions by using the raise hand feature or button in the Zoom, so that we can acknowledge you, or you may just feel free to unmute yourselves. Or also you may send your questions via the chat box. Yeah. So, pwede po tayo magtanong sa ating guest speaker kung may mga questions po tayo. And, okay. Yan.
Yes, I do have a comment here. If I may read it out loud for everyone. It's sent to me via direct message, and thus I will not share who this individual is, but if I can just share with everyone, it's written here. In blended learning, how do you deal with situations where students don't say anything at all? In class, you can see body language and feedback, but in the Philippines, many students have cameras off due to internet connectivity issues. Yes, I love that question as well. I love that because I find that for face-to-face, that physical presence, we somehow we cannot replicate that physical presence, right? We can see our students and we play off each other's expressions and body language. And indeed, for blended learning, whether it is about the limitation of the tool, the tech or connectivity, we may not be able to consider that. I find that other tools to engage them. If let's say video is not possible, then getting our students to even interact with our screens, letting them annotate with very purposeful, bite-sized little activities is going to help. Because the one thing that our students are saying that they hate blended learning is because they feel that instructors or tutors forget about them, that they don't feel like as if their presence is being felt by their tutor. That is very telling for me when it comes to faculty development. So when we talk about it, the faculty are saying, oh yeah, that's right, because I kind of forget that they're there. You know, because my screen is only this big, I will have to see my PowerPoint slide and I will have to see myself. As some of them say, I have to see myself talking because the students are not there anyway. Their videos are turned off. So because of that, the assumption is our students are there listening in to us and as engaged as we want them to be. But when we ask our students, it's very telling when they say, instructors forget that we're there. So what's the point? What's the point of being engaged? Because we're not needed to be engaged. So if let's say videos are turned off because of connectivity, we have to consider how can we at various moments in time check in with our students, even if it is as small as, if you think this, put up the emoji icon. If you consider this, do that. At the very least, engage our students that way. If not, there are so many tools. Miro as a board, right? Or Mentimeter. So those various tools will be really, really helpful if we can't have them engage them in a video. Another technique that we were discussing here in SIT is that we get our students to share a snapshot of themselves. How are they at the start of the seminar? Take a photo and put it into an online platform, say a Google Drive or something. So capturing a moment of themselves taking a selfie is also getting our students to share just a brief moment of how they are feeling, how they look like that morning before the class, and expressing or acknowledging the emotions that they have. And I thought that was very helpful. Yes, I see this one as the ideal class size for dialogic teaching to be efficiently applied. Wow, if I could have that magic number, it will be amazing. But notice how scholars, Alexander went to so many countries, India and quite a number, and even in England, to look at dialogic teaching. And while he reported the number in those classrooms that he visited, and no one has ever said that the ideal size is something. So I personally feel it's a matter of our own skills in engaging others. Like for example, if you have a class size of 10, what can you do with that class size of 10? I noticed that this question has not quite asked when it comes to face-to-face or blended learning. So that ideal class size is actually dependent on the tools at hand. What tools do you have when it is face-to-face, and what tools or the format or design of the instructional activities do you have when it's blended learning? All I can say is it does take a bit of effort to engage any number of students in online platforms. Talking about online platforms, I don't know whether you've heard of Minerva University, Minerva, Minerva University. I think lately they've been deemed to be the most innovative university in the whole world, because they do not have a campus and they only engage their students online, and they develop their video conferencing tool, a very advanced version of Zoom before the pandemic. And so I'm trying to learn from Minerva University. What is it about engaging our students online that we are missing? Yes, there's one question here. Do you find that critical thinking varies much according to discipline? Yeah, many of the STEM profs say yes. There's critical thinking. We do it very differently in engineering, or we do it very differently in accountancy. But personally, for me and the team here that's considering or studying criticality, I would say it does not quite vary as much. I think the discipline is like the discipline, and whatever discipline specific skills and knowledge that's important is in consideration. But at the end of the day, the critical thinking tools are applied onto whatever the discipline is. So which is why another exciting thing for us is that many of our engineering and other profs are talking about design. Even our food product technologies program are also talking about design. And design thinking is a methodology, and we're thinking, how can we blend critical and design thinking? And the key thing is always, no matter the discipline, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, no matter the discipline, how can we actually exercise our students' intellectual muscle? That is also something very fascinating. At the end of the day, it's this muscle that we're trying to get our students to sharpen and exercise. Yes, I'm really loving the comments and questions here, colleagues. There's one here. Sometimes to encourage students to speak their minds, I would say there's no right or wrong answer, but I'm afraid it would only encourage them not to be critical. What is your thought about this technique? Yeah. Oh, wow. Yes, there's no right or wrong answer. You're right, actually, because I do find that colleagues sometimes with the intention to want to assure as students that it is all right to say what you want to say. Faculty or educators tend to say there's no right or wrong. In fact, when I was in school, I think I remember teachers telling me it's okay, there's no right or wrong. Perhaps that, I would say, need not be highlighted. Instead, encouraging our students to share varied perspectives, to share their consideration of complexity. So if we use critical thinking tools, that's actually the standards of breadth and depth. So instead of assuring them that way, there's no right or wrong, we can consider getting our students to apply very explicitly and visibly such that they see it in their students or their peers' responses. What is that tool that they're using to increase the criticality of thought of everyone, instead of saying there's no right or wrong. Yes, but I love that. Just like how I shared earlier that I banned the word agree and disagree. So moving our students away from this and that. You know, no need for them to say, I agree with you, I disagree with you, or no need for us also as educators to say, it's okay, there's no right or wrong. Yeah, and I'm talking about, you know, when you say that encourage them not to be critical, this is something that I think personally, I'm also on a mission for students not to think that critical thinking is about being critical. And somehow that critical disposition is linked to us finding fault. Yeah, and whoever I speak to, the students here in Singapore, or any young ones, I would always encourage them to think of critical thinking as not that. It's just that you happen to be assessing, you have this intellectual perseverance to want to see the bigger picture, to want to go deeper. It's not because you're finding fault or being censorious and critical about things, but because you are considering it all, because you have the disposition of confidence in reasoning. Yeah, and some of the other intellectual dispositions about having intellectual humility and intellectual empathy. So encouraging those dispositions, I would say, would be a huge help. Yeah. Yes. Wow, quite a number. I don't know about you. It is 11:30. I could go on actually. I don't know. Organizers, please stop me if I have to stop. But otherwise, I'm going to engage with these. Yeah, it is uncommon. It is not uncommon to have lecture halls of 300 students or more. Yes, indeed, you're right. For some programs, it can get quite large. But thanks to the pandemic, there has been some restriction to how large that size will be. Well, I love this question. What is the teacher's role in the dialogue? Does the teacher direct the dialogue? That is actually one of the technique in terms of the function of scaffolding or dialogic scaffolding, and that is it when it comes to direction maintenance. I would say there's a place for that, for sure, especially when the entire class discussion goes somewhat off tangent to a contentious area of discussion, and that you find that you need to reel the students back in, especially when it is going to exclude certain students. Yeah, I would say when it comes to making sure that everyone's perspectives and voices are heard, I would play the role of the direction maintenance person if, let's say, the discussion is excluding others or highlighting perhaps a certain group is more superior than other. Then that I would play that role of directing the dialogue. But who says we need to be that person? Encourage our students to play that role too. So I think that's actually quite, yes. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, I've got to read this. One feedback I get from students is that I give clear instructions. I appreciate that. But sometimes I notice that some outputs don't meet the brief, right? If some students get it and some students don't, do I adjust the way I articulate instructions, or do focus on encouraging the students who aren't quite there to think more critically? I don't want them to feel left out, and I think my job is to help them reach the bar. Yes, oh, that's quite a lot there to unpack. But the key thing I'm noticing is that what if some students' outputs don't meet the brief? Yeah, we do quite a number of things. Personally, I engage in I get students to do consultations with me. And the main thing about the brief is, if that seemingly is the point that you're making there, especially for students who aren't quite there, that whole class discussion about the brief would be very important. Sometimes we may be designing the brief in such a way that we view it this way, we envision the output to be this way, but our students are envisioning and thinking about the brief in another way. To get to match that and to make sure that there's no disconnect, get the students to talk to us and in class about the brief. I would think that would be best, because ultimately for me, it's very simple. Tutor's perspective, student's perspective. We are explicit, we think we are explicit, but for our students, they may not see it the way we see. So how do we then bridge that gap? So internalizing whatever criticality of thought, if that is to be the aim there, if you mentioned unquite there, then perhaps that has to be made visible. Annotate our talk, pull it out, get it out of our students. If we say the brief is this, is that what the students think the brief is? If it's not, then let's pull out those assumptions, unpack those assumptions, and clarify the accuracy, precision, and relevance and significance of the brief together, jointly constructed with our students. Yes. Entertain. Yeah, one last question. Sure. I think that's it in terms of direct message that I've gotten here. Right. Yeah. Oh, there's one more here. One observation I have about the students is that they are afraid to make mistakes. Yes, I always ask why, which I think is due to the like culture promoted by social media. Yes, if they commit a mistake, they would be bashed. This is an extra challenge to helping students to simply just speak their minds, be critical, and make a stand. Yes, absolutely. And for this, I must say, the framework that we've adopted, the Paul Elder framework, focusing on those dispositions will be excellent, because Paul and Elder list of dispositions, there are very a specific description about each of the disposition. So you notice that in there's intellectual empathy. So it's not that we are empathetic in general about those around us, but we are empathetic about their intellectual pursuit of knowledge, or their intellectual demonstration of their understanding, how they unpack something. We are empathetic to their perspective and their point of view. So if we as educators emphasize and highlight these dispositions, I think our students will not feel like as if I will always be judged. No matter what opinion I have, if I were to share it, others will say that they are in support or they are not in support. And that's the problem with the binary approach, isn't it? A very dichotomous, isn't it? A dichotomous teaching. It's either you like or you don't like, either you agree or you disagree. But the nuances of the reasoning and the arguments are not quite unpacked. So if we can model it and start in our classrooms, my only hope is that our students graduate with that confidence in reasoning, that disposition to be intellectually empathetic and intellectually humble about their knowledge of the world. And I will not say that, the like culture is bad. You do not do that or do not apply that. I will not say that. because I would say that there is a place for it, and if Facebook is that place, then so be it. But what we can do to get our students to be those critical thinkers is that we can highlight those dispositions. Yes. Oh, thank you so much.